Okay, so I do think this is everybody. If you haven't met me yet, my name is Shri. I'm one of the instructors with the AT Lab. And this presentation is titled The Gulf War Did Happen, play on Baudrillard's famous collection of 1991 essays titled The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. My task here is to provide a general survey of Baudrillard's writing as it relates to debate, talk about some affirmative responses, and to provide some reading recommendations. There are going to be a bunch of elements that are rather abstract. So my suggestion would be to take some notes of your questions, so you might have a collection of these at the end of the debate. I want to sort of start with, why Baudrillard and why are we talking about this? I think the interest in Baudrillard's thought has been renewed and receded based on the competitive success of college teams that have then trickled down to high school. So my debate career 10 years ago, had a part in this. When I debated, I basically solely debated a planless Baudrillard F and read one off Baudrillard in the negative, which might seem a little weird to you considering my current set of predilections about debate. It's sort of my opinion that debate's fascination with Baudrillard's work can be traced to three main characteristics of his writing. First, he's a really prolific writer. His claims apply to nearly every position taken in debates. He's levied criticisms about nuclear managers, IR scholars, environmental activists, humanitarians, Marxists, and all kinds of political philosophy, which makes sort of Baudrillard's work sort of a good place to put together sort of a large swath of link arguments to a bunch of different Fs. Second, given debate's sort of affinity towards French and German post-structuralist thinking, and its emphasis on Friedrich Nietzsche and his contemporaries in particular, Baudrillard fits perfectly into what I like to kind of call debate's canon of authors. And lastly, Baudrillard is in some ways kind of the troll of academia, and I mean this in the most endearing way possible. He calls out intellectuals who oftentimes take their thought too seriously, and his argumentation tends to itself be very playful speech acts that confound some of his opponents and antagonists with outlandish statements, i.e., the Gulf War did not take place. Obviously, the Gulf War did occur, but there is a larger criticism being made, and other sort of more poetic aphorisms. He's often famous for this quote that when others seek a little more meaning, I seek a little more artifice. Generally speaking to some of the sort of seriousness of his opponents and sort of the levity of his responses to them. Before I sort of jump into some core concepts, my initial suggestion when approaching Baudrillard arguments is not to treat it as a coherent philosophy where you can read the same 2AC every time to anything that has the name Baudrillard attached to it. Due to sort of his aphoristic writing style, so aphorism, instead of having like a systematic philosophy that sort of like lays out all the things in advance, aphorism means he's writing in a very poetic way, in a way that can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways. And that means that sort of the task of universally interpreting this Baudrillard stuff is kind of impossible and depends a little bit on the arguments that are being made in the debate. And I think that's been reflected through the diversity of link arguments and some of the subtle distinctions and framing arguments that people have had in the past. So, my hope is that this lecture serves to assist you in navigating some of the very complex parts of his work, so you can come to your own conclusions and develop your own spin. And when looking through a 2AC, to try to respond to the kinds of arguments that they are making about Baudrillard, as opposed to making the 2AC to Baudrillard that is the same in every debate. With that, I'm going to jump into some of the core concepts in Baudrillard's theory. So concept one is the strategy of the subject versus the strategy of the object. So strategy of the subject versus strategy of the object. I think when debate folks are introduced to Baudrillard, the first concept they tend to hear is about the idea of hyperreality and simulations. While sort of important and interesting, I don't think this is the foundation for Baudrillard's work, and starting with it tends to invite a lot of misinterpretation. So just as a quick aside, starting the discussion of, simulation and hyperreality as sort of the focus of Baudrillard arguments invites sort of the misunderstanding that Baudrillard is proposing a criticism of technology, digitization, or television, concluding with sort of a bad take that we, live in a simulation, and the alternative is to break out of the simulation and return to said real world. If there are any movie buffs here, this misinterpretation is super ever present in The Matrix, a movie that's often credited with popularizing a lot of Baudrillard's philosophy by showcasing, there's actually like in the first 5 minutes of the movie, the book Simulacra and Simulation by Baudrillard is like on the desk of the protagonist's desk. And rumors say that the people who directed the film, Wachowski brothers, essentially forced the principal cast and crew, including Keanu Reeves, which is pretty funny, to read the book and understand the themes of the movie. I can only imagine sad Keanu like flipping through Baudrillard and trying to figure out what is going on. But embarrassingly enough, they ended up reading the book backwards because they started with sort of the concept of hyperreality to drive their conclusions. Baudrillard has this fairly famous comment that he was asked about The Matrix at one point, and Baudrillard was like, the most embarrassing part of the film is that The Matrix is surely the kind of film about The Matrix that The Matrix would have been able to produce. So I think like starting with hyperreality, probably the wrong place. So let's sideline sort of hyperreality for a second. We'll get back in a bit, but let's sideline that. What is the main foundation of Baudrillard's writing then? So if you're interested in learning more about Baudrillard, I'd start with the writing in his book, The Intelligence of Evil, or another book, The Fatal Strategies. Those are the 2 books I'd start with. And to summarize, the main conflict in Baudrillard's work is this Manichean opposition between the strategy of the subject and strategy of the object. So let's break that apart a little bit. The word Manichean implies a binary, an antagonism. There's one thing versus another, right? In this case, it's the subject versus the object. Going back to the Matrix example, right? I think this is probably one, even if you haven't seen The Matrix, that you probably know of, is Neo at one point is given the choice between the red pill and the blue pill. So it's like, if you take the red pill, you essentially, I forgot which pill is which, but I'm pretty sure the red pill is the one where you learn about the Matrix and then you go fight it. And then the blue pill is the one where you're like, you just go back home and you don't know about the Matrix. You'll just live out the rest of your life. This quote, I think, exemplifies sort of that, Manichean divide between subject and object, right? The red pill is the strategy of the subject. It valorizes, and glorifies free will to understand what is around you and to intervene and act. It vilifies spectatorship, right? So it vilifies the choice of the blue pill that's just like, whatever. We live in a matrix, we'll just go back home. That sort of exemplifies the, thing that Baudrillard is criticizing, right? Neo's decision to take the red pill is actually what Baudrillard calls the banal strategy of the subject. And attempt by an individual with knowledge and power to intervene in politics and emphasizes qualities like agency, autonomy, and responsibility, and versus the choice of the blue pill, which is depicted as cowardly, ignorant, and lazy. The Western political tradition centers an episteme or way of thinking that sings praises of being politicized and puts the strategy of the subject on a pedestal to be mimicked by future generations, right? So weirdly enough, actually, I think Baudrillard, if he was watching The Matrix, would say you should take the blue pill. That it's okay. Like the Matrix might exist, but like at least you're not really bothered by it if you take the blue pill, and you'll just live out your life and die. And yeah, I guess you'll be part of the Matrix, but who cares? That's sort of the final conclusion that I think Baudrillard kind of comes to. That's sort of what he's talking about when he talks about the need to accelerate or mimic the system, right? It's not really about fighting the system, taking the red pill and fighting it, but it's about sort of a indifference and passivity with the full knowledge that the system itself might be unjust. And I think this is something that sort of trends a lot in some of Western political traditions. So, for example, Immanuel Kant, who's one of like the famous German philosophers, writes that the Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another, and that freedom implies the capacity to use reason publicly in all matters to improve the civil order. I think this reasoning is often present in a set of traditional framework arguments that envision debate as a forum to train students to, if not become future policymakers, at least become more proactive citizens that understand what's going on in the world. And that is essentially the red pill strategy, right? It's like there's politics that's out there, you try to understand it, and you should, as an ethical subject, try to intervene in it. I think even strategies with a more revolutionary bent tend to employ a very similar approach to this world. So, Che Guevara in his manifesto is like, the guerrilla fighter must have a moral conduct that shows him to be a true priest of the reform to which he aspires. To the Stoicism should be added an austerity born of rigid self-control that will prevent a single excess, a single slip, whatever the circumstances. So, the point here being, there are even sort of a set of Marxists or sort of more lefty folks that are used in debates that call for sort of revolutionary commitment accompanied with a counterpublic that exercises its freedom to be responsive, right? To escape the shackles that are, imposed by alienation that holds them back. So why is Baudrillard like, we should just take the blue pill? I'm going to briefly read this passage from his book, Fatal Strategies, and then we'll break it down together. So he says, and this is actually, I think, one of the more important portions of his writing. So he's like, why privilege the position of the subject? Why support this fiction of a will, conscience, even of an unconscious for the subject? Because the subject has an economy and a history, which is quite reassuring. It's the equilibrium between a will and a world, a drive and an object, the balancing principle of the universe. And again, this is quite reassuring, for then it is not delivered up to multiple, monstrous, fascinating universe, the cruel and aleatory universe, a seduction that comes out from the blue, nor is a victim or prey to all surrounding forms, living or dead, not traversed by incessant seductions. And then it says, I'm going to skip a couple of these because obviously he rants and writes in a very aphoristic and sort of vague way. Let's see. But the subject, the metaphysics of the subject was beautiful only in its arrogant glory and its caprice and its inexhaustible will to power and its transcendence as the subject of art, the subject of history, the dramaturgy of its alienation. Finished with all that, it is now only a miserable carcass in conflict with its own desire for its own image, incapable of managing a coherent representation of the world, pointlessly sacrificed on the corpse of history in an attempted resurrection. Okay, so that was a mouthful. I think the most sort of important idea here is a critique of free will. A critique of free will. So, quote, the subject has only found itself trapped in the melodrama of its own disappearance, is overdosed on resignation, looking for a gentleman's agreement with its object, which it has felt is strong enough to manipulate to its own advantage. This quote and the set of quotes that I've had above exemplifies a theoretical foundation for many of debate's post-structuralist authors. It's a critique of a unified, stable notion of a self, being, or subject. So the easiest way to sort of think about this, aside from all the big words, is at our core, we're just essentially a bag of chemicals. There's not really a soul or a self inside of us that decides every action and thought that we might have, but it's rather a process of biological and chemical reactions that are clearly beyond our control or comprehension that serves as the basis of what we call our intentions and actions. So for example, when I say, for example, I want ice cream, it's not like my soul or myself willed me to want ice cream, right? There are a number of unexplainable neural or chemical interactions that are outside of your control that make you want ice cream. So it's not that you willed yourself to want ice cream, it's the thought of ice cream that has seduced you, right? So Baudrillard sort of inverts the idea of subjects willing things and objects seducing things. It's not us, the subject, who desires, but the biological, chemical, psychological, and other processes that seduce us into desiring things. We are nothing but objects in a network of objects, traversed by seductions in the world that interact in unpredictable and mysterious ways, occasionally resulting in new phenomena. This is actually sort of why a set of Baudrillard folks will have this quote that's like, we should not always try to seek meaning, but we should always try to embrace enigma. The point being that we can't sort of master and will the world in a certain way, but it's sort of something that is beyond our comprehension. And, for Baudrillard, even our bodies themselves are foreign to us, right? It's not like we control all the things that are in our bodies that produce the thoughts that we have. It's impossible to sort of delineate ourselves as totally autonomous because we obviously cannot will, for example, our emotional state. Like, it's not like we want to be sad. It's like sadness happens to us. And beyond that, it's like we are intersected by a number of historical, cultural, and ideological, seductions that precede our existence, even our language, right? It's not like we willed ourselves to, know English. It's like English has existed way before we existed as human beings. And we are inculcated in a set of seductions that have existed that, train us to think in a certain way. So that's sort of Baudrillard's critique of free will, is essentially that we don't have it. Functionally saying that we're sort of a bunch of subjects within a field of many subjects that all sort of have an interplay that we do not will ourselves. What's the negative consequence then of thinking about free will? So Baudrillard sort of concludes this chapter in Fatal Strategies saying, quote, "We live in a culture which strives to return to each of us full responsibility for his own life. The moral responsibility inherited from the Christian tradition has been augmented with the help of the whole modern apparatus of information and communication by the requirement that everyone should be answerable for every aspect of their lives. And what this amounts to is an expulsion of the other, who has indeed become perfectly useless in the context of a pre-programmed management of life, a regimen that can be expected to be entirely responsible for their own life. This modern ideal is futile and arrogant. It is a utopian notion with no justification whatsoever. It requires that the individual transform themselves into a slave to their identity, their will, their responsibilities, their desire, and that they should start exercising control over their own circuitry, as well as all the worldwide circuits that happen to cross paths within their genes and nerves of thought, a truly unheard of servitude." So, again, to unpack sort of that big rant, and again, this should sort of give you an idea of what I mean when I'm saying Baudrillard is a lot more aphoristic, right? He's not like writing a very systematic philosophy. He's writing almost like he's writing poetry or writing a set of vague things that could be interpreted in a bunch of different ways. But I think the sort of easiest understanding that you can get to is that one consequence of sort of the idea of free will is the burden of responsibility, right? Let's say for a second that it's true that there is no such thing as free will, that we are not subjects, we don't act and desire and intend things. Those are all sort of products of seduction. If that's true, can we really truly say that we should be morally responsible for the set of intentions and pursuant actions we might take? Right? Probably not, because it's not that you are causing them. You are not really a causer, you are the caused, right? Another sort of consequence is that Western Enlightenment and critical rationality, so like think of the Marxists that I had talked about earlier, that valorize a certain set of moral actors, as a corollary, essentially demonize those who are not in line with said moral actors and visit violence. Oftentimes this impact and debate is phrased as a claim about radical alterity. So we only approve of others who are slightly different, but at least maintain intelligibility within a certain set of norms. But when alterity is too radical, too challenging to deal with, we are willing to exterminate them. So that's the first sort of step and concept that I want to go over. What should the affirmative set of responses be? Well, I think at its core, the affirmative response has to include a defense of subjectivity and subject as a concept, right? So Baudrillard essentially is like, in this Manikin divide between object and subject, we should always pick the object. We should always take the blue pill, and, we can't really control what's happening to us. The affirmative has to sort of do the other side, which is to describe that there needs to be a politicized agent that wills and intends to act. So there's this pretty good Todd May card that people used to read, that explains that even if sort of subjectivity is not static, we don't control everything. Like obviously we don't control things like whether we're sad or happy at any given time. The assumption that there is a subject is still valuable for our political work. So even if there's no subject per se, the assumption of a subject is valuable for our political works. And the sort of pursuing idea is the idea that we should be responsible in the case of things like immediate harm or suffering, extinction, etc. So yeah, we obviously can't be responsible for like our emotional states, or we might not be able to be responsible for things like wanting ice cream at a certain moment of time. But you certainly should be, or have a fiction of an idea of responsibility or subject in the case of solving things like immediate harm, extinction, etc. And this is generally a set of cards that I would read kind of across the board, contradicting my original advice that was like, don't read the same 2AC. This card is one that you should generally read, because I do think that all critiques that are based on some of these Baudrillard arguments are based on some idea of that divide between subject and object. Sorry. In other situations, you definitely should not just read the same 2AC. Concept two. So that was concept one. Obviously kind of a mouthful. Concept two is politics as auto-deconstructive. Auto is an automatic, deconstructive as in deconstructing. Of some of the arguments that Baudrillard makes, I think this is the most interesting for the negative. If you want a really sort of simple way to think about this as a debate strategy, it's essentially a terminal defense argument. added with a turns case argument. So terminal defense plus turns case. And the general thesis of this is that social engineering, or attempting to fix the world and manage the world that is geared towards a particular conclusion, is ineffective and oftentimes backfires and results in the opposite result. So, social engineering and attempt to manage the world oftentimes backfires and leads to the opposite result that we wanted. Obviously, this is a pretty general claim. And Baudrillard sort of tailors this commentary to very specific contexts, including nuclearism, feminism, Native American issues, the economy, warming, and a bunch of other issues. Instead of sort of rehashing every version of this argument, I'm going to give you a couple examples of how the strategy of the subject is auto-deconstructive, a couple in terms of debate and a couple in terms of American politics in general. So example one, this one is going to be sort of more centered towards debate. So if you think about the common person's vision of debate, so if you ask your mom and dad, what they think debate is, or if I watch the film The Great Debaters, right? Generally the conclusion is debate is supposed to be a persuasive speaking activity that creates a model that maybe cultivates you to be a better policymaker, political activist, and be more sort of attuned with sort of current events in the real world. Status quo policy debate in sort of that goal has ultimately reached the opposite conclusion, and its well-meaning attempts to make itself really applicable, right? The idea of things like spreading to include as many, arguments that are as good as possible has sort of created a situation where we've, started with the well-intentioned ideal that's like, we should have sort of a persuasive speaking activity where we reach audiences to, we've sort of taken that logic to its extreme, then like we should have as many ideas as possible that we should deliberate over. And that has translated to a set of things that maybe has been the opposite of what we might talk about debate. Another sort of example is in content, right? So, policy debate in its attempt to generate in-depth education and gear us towards switching side has taken that task to its extreme. It's maybe sort of a hyper simulation where we've talked about nuclear war scenarios that we don't really have any connection with. It's why debaters might be able to win on really wild arguments like Wipeout in an actively, in a game that's supposed to be actively geared towards political education, right? So Baudrillard might be like some of the intentions that you might have about debate or about political education. Oftentimes, if you follow its logic to its extreme, are auto-deconstructive, that the initial aim has essentially been transposed into the exact opposite conclusion. Here's another sort of different example. And this is one that Baudrillard gives in relationship to politics. So example two is this May 1968 terrorist bombing, which is an example that he likes to give quite a bit. So just to give you sort of a brief history of this time, he's referencing sort of a set of university movements that were happening in France in 1968 in May. And there were a set of folks essentially that were striking for labor rights, etc. And there was a bunch of stuff that was happening. And Baudrillard sort of gives this idea that after, and the other sort of notable thing is after May 1968, this movement fizzled completely. Like it was just gone. And Baudrillard sort of writes about this by saying, quote, it is through the simulation of a narrow, conventional field of perspective in which the premises and the consequences of an act or an event can be calculated, that political credibility can be maintained. If one envisions the entire cycle of an act or an event in which a system where linear continuity and dialectical determination evaporates, every act is terminated at the end of the cycle, having benefited everyone and having been scattered in all directions. Is any given bombing in Italy the work of leftist extremists, or extreme right provocation, or a centrist miscene to discredit all extreme terrorists and to shore up its failing power? Or is it a police-inspired scenario and a form of blackmail to public security? All of this is simultaneously true, and the search for proof, indeed the objectivity of facts, does not put an end to this vertigo of interpretation. So the point that sort of Baudrillard is making there is just like, there might have been a certain intent behind a set of movements within May 68, but sort of the way that the media, for example, covered sort of the objective things that happened and cherry-picked certain events made it such that, that event didn't transfer the meaning that some of the activists had originally wanted. It is simultaneously true that there was a bombing in Italy Was that, matter of, a terrorist that had bombed things? Were they a freedom fighter? Is this a thing that's made up by public security and overinflated? All of those things might simultaneously be true, making it very difficult for us to ascertain the truth or objective reality of a certain political event. Here's a couple of examples that might help you, in terms of some, specific examples to now. So think about global warming, right? The data is perpetually being produced by both the warming is real and not real camps. This evidence has been piling up for decades now, right? And basically what has happened at this point is that people are not necessarily reading both sides for the truth anymore, really. They're just sort of, they've taken a certain ideology and then they've essentially stuck with them and like, our side is correct. It does not really matter that, for example, if I was a climate denier, I am not, but if I was a climate denier, like giving me an article that's like global warming is good is unlikely to persuade me that global warming is, false, right? Like I'm about to just be like, oh yeah, your article is probably just made up. It's a conspiracy theory. I just included, whatever it is that you've given me into the original thing that I had already thought about. Another good example is I think COVID and anti-maskers. It's like there is quite a bit of evidence that says you should wear a mask when you go outside. There's quite a bit of people who are just like, you can give them as much information as we want. You can be as persuasive as you want. It's not really going to change anything, right? Or at Thanksgiving dinner, it's like your racist aunt, like you can be very persuasive that BLM is, maybe good and not terrorists, right? But that's probably not going to persuade them in any way. That's sort of what Baudrillard is talking about when he's like, there's not really a way to rationally persuade people in this moment. And this is sort of where the idea of hyperreality comes into play. So the argument that Baudrillard is making is not that we are plugged into like a simulation, like Matrix style, or that there isn't a real world out there, but when the world has been mediated by a set of discourses or language, it loses its objective referent. So I'm going to repeat that. So it's not like there's no real world. It's not like we're plugged into a simulation or something, but that when the world has been mediated by discourses, that there is no objective reference. So, you might give me a bunch of persuasive articles that say I should wear a mask, but the initial thought that I had was already the thing that is predetermined how I'm going to think about the issue for the rest of perpetuity, right? What I might say about, climate change and its reality is unable to disseminate meaning, to persuade. This is why people like to use the cliche phrase, information is dissuasive. It's like they don't literally mean that giving information about global warming dissuades you. They mean that, no amount of persuasive, rational information is really going to fix it. And the reason why this set of arguments is pretty powerful in the context of debate, I think, is that debate is fundamentally a persuasive activity. And the set of arguments you're making about sort of skills and the need for politics all sort of belie this general idea, which is that there is some benefit to persuading people and learning how to persuade people about, certain political issues. But if Baudrillard's critique is right, it sort of denies some of the value that debate has, aside from it being a game, there's like, and being fun or whatever. It's like, there's no skill that you've generated, because what really does that change? It's like, I guess you can very persuasively now talk to me about how criminal justice reform is broken, but you're unlikely to change the minds of your, tough on crime grandparents, right? For example, that's sort of the, strength of this set of arguments. And I think, one thing that both the affirmative and negative has to think about is being able to give some of these examples. So, if I literally just said the words information is dissuasive, you'd probably be like, what are you talking about? Who cares? The set of examples that I'm giving, global warming, COVID, I imagine CJR and grandparents, these are examples that probably resonated with at least some of you, right? And these are sort of the set of examples that you want to be giving, if you're negative and if you're affirmative. It's important to do a couple of things. And this is where I'm going to talk about some of the responses. First, before you go to the set of examples, it's important to create a framing argument. So they've made sort of a, holistic claim that's like, persuasion is impossible, rational information dissuasion is bad, etc. You need to sort of make the set of arguments that's like a totalizing account of the absolute impossibility to disseminate our meanings and articulate our intentions and persuade people is wrong. And you should have sort of a set of examples that are specific, right? So for example, I would think that one thing that you could do is to use some of the conversation about the climate of protests that's currently happening. Be like, you know, it would be sort of impossible for us to have a conversation about defund police. Like, imagine if we were having a conversation about defunding policing in like February, right? That, like, no one would, everybody would be like, what are you talking about? But the sort of set of interactions that have happened because of the climate of protest has sort of moved that conversation productively towards the left, right? And the thing that you want to sort of say is, you know, not only do you have an example, but that one example should be enough to break that totalizing thesis. Like, you're right, sometimes persuasion fails. I can't persuade my racist grandma, sure. But at the margins, I can still persuade people to describe, you know, a certain set of political events and maybe to change some of their feelings about politics. It's also sort of important to read cards about your affirmative in relationship to what people like to call a post-fact world. So I think the best sort of negative arguments will be like, Trump is sort of the extreme example of reality losing its referent, right? You know, Hillary Clinton made a set of very sound arguments that were politically based. She was very trained in legalese, and we elected a buffoon. It's like, yeah, you know, that's like a kind of an example of how sort of some of these Baudrillard teams will be like, perhaps this rational persuasion thing doesn't work. Having a set of evidence from sort of this Trump era, this like fake news, you know, post-fact era, and describing sort of the reason why we need to have reasoned, rational forms of debate is sort of a key part to answer sort of this general thesis claim about the dissuasiveness of things like information and debate as a persuasive activity. There's another sort of component to this. Politics is auto-deconstructive claim. And it's generally a set of offensive case turns and external impacts that are associated. They tend to be pretty different per group, but you should sort of remember the initial formula that's like, the Baudrillard team is trying to go for terminal defense, like, you know, dissuade, you know, information is dissuasive, so there's no point doing any of this. And the offensive claim that's like, the politics that you have actually ends up in the opposite end. So let's think of a couple of examples together. I think one sort of very common one that you'll likely hear is if you're reading a set of affirmatives that are focused on structural violence. And namely, sort of Baudrillard calls this, you know, idea charity cannibalism. You've likely heard of it. The argument being essentially that, you know, representations of suffering, although they're meant to mobilize publics, have a tendency to desensitize publics, right? You know, the more we're fed sort of the images of the climates of protest, the more likely we're just going to be like, oh yeah, that's just, you know, everyday mundane stuff. At this point, it's like nothing really scares us. 2020 has been kind of nuts and very spectacular, right? The newest spectacle in July is unlikely to move you very much. You're just going to be like, well, I'm still quarantined, and also the world outside is on fire. Not much has changed, right? And that's sort of Baudrillard's claim, which is like the feeding of additional spectacles, while it's supposed to mobilize people, tends to make them more complacent. There's also a set of external impacts that people have talked about in relationship to charity cannibalism. So Baudrillard, this is from Simulation and Simulacra, if you end up deciding you want to cut the book. And I think the chapter is literally titled Charity Cannibalism. There's an external sort of impact claim that's like, the sort of more that we're fed spectacles, the more that we end up trying to thrill seek, and the more that we try to present ourselves as saviors. So there's a set of arguments essentially that he's talking about in relationship to, so this is written in 1994, so these examples are a little bit old, but he'll make sort of this claim about the war in Afghanistan. The reason why we went into sort of that war initially before 2001 was because we had a bunch of sort of examples of folks who were not saying that it was important for security. They were all saying that the women in Afghanistan are being brutalized by the Taliban, and thus we need to go intervene and give them democracy. And sort of the claim that Baudrillard is making is sort of that in the attempt to provide charity, in the attempt to create spectacles, we have created a set of interventions that have a set of external impacts that, you know, turn the end of those things. It's like the war in Afghanistan has been terrible for women. And yet a lot of the sort of moral impetus for it was about, you know, saving the women from sort of the strict, you know, Muslim culture that the Taliban had replaced. And that's sort of the, you know, set of arguments about the turns case component that are relevant. Another sort of separate example, nuclear deterrence. So same book, literally, I think it's actually titled Nuclear Deterrence. Like, he has a set of arguments essentially that are just like, nuclear deterrence is essentially a snake eating its own tail. We don't really have nuclear conflicts. You know, just the history since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have not had a nuclear bomb drop anywhere. And Baudrillard's claim essentially is that the idea of deterrence has given us this fake idea that we live in a very peaceful situation. When in fact, war has sort of transitioned from dropping bombs on each other to a lot more sort of informal context, right? So, right now, wars are, waged on ideas. Terrorism, like, what does that even mean? We're not in war with Germany. We're in a war with an idea that can never end, or war on drugs, a war on crime. And Baudrillard's sort of argument is that sort of the focus on deterrence and war, right, as a nuclear war, a spectacle, is one that has both desensitized us and had us sort of ignore and misunderstand sort of the ways that war actually now takes place in sort of a post-deterrence world. So these are all sort of like general examples that I'm giving specific examples that I'm giving of Baudrillard sort of connecting some of his politics or auto-deconstructive work to sort of the larger implication, right? If deterrence was supposed to stop war, it is now causing war. If charity, it was supposed to stop suffering, it is now causing more suffering. And that's sort of a set of arguments that, you'll likely hear quite a bit on the negative side of the critique. Okay, so what does the affirmative do about this? I think one of the things that makes or breaks the successful Baudrillard debate is giving a set of examples. Everybody's cards are terrible. The Baudrillard cards are aphoristic. They're not writing about the 1AC. So literally, when you've heard the last couple of Baudrillard cards, it's not like you can be like, oh yeah, that's obviously a transparency link to the Capitol Police Act. It's like, that's not happening, right? It's like, I'm literally spinning a set of words that I'm like, this seems to indicate a certain set of things. Baudrillard's very dead. So he's also not writing about COVID or similarly, affirmative cards are also very old and mostly very bad. So a lot of affirmative cards tend to just be generally talking about Baudrillard's work. So they'll be like, I really took issue to when Baudrillard talked about, the 1968 May terrorist bombing, and it's like, who cares, right? And that's usually sort of what happens to you when you read a set of Baudrillard answers, and the neg is just like, this criticizes some area of his theory that we have literally zero relationship to. So go home. And then usually the negative wins because they're right. Instead, sort of what's important is connecting some of your more general cards to specific examples. So, charity cannibalism example with the war in Afghanistan. It is very important for the affirmative to come back and be like, no, not all charity results in the war in Afghanistan. Like, for example, the climate of protests and perhaps the spectacle that is surrounding it has mobilized a larger movement that has sort of exposed the racism of American society very successfully. And there has not been a situation where the left has now, we did not then intervene in Afghanistan because we have a climate of protests in the United States, right? So making a very sort of direct causal relationship that's like, this is what our AF is about. This is how the AF could, work without causing the bad thing you're causing. And then be like, the thing you're saying it causes does not have a connection, is sort of the way that you want to go through this. Or, let's say you're taking the example in nuclear deterrence. Like, you might be like, the sort of assumption that, nuclear war can never possibly break out seems like a tenuous one. The 1AC has given a bunch of examples where, in fact, nuclear deterrence arrangements are breaking. You can make a set of arguments that's like, no, it does not result in a war on terrorism to suggest that the United States and China should reevaluate their deterrence commitments, right? So making sort of very direct connections to the way that they're sort of spinning their arguments is a very important part of being affirmative. So, you want to make sure and sort of respond to their very reductionist claims about how they're considering politics and how it plays out, and their universal and total application of how they think that, it might turn the case. Okay, last sort of set of things I want to talk about is, what to say about the alternative. So I think Baudrillard alternatives tend to be pretty diverse, but they all fundamentally sort of rely on this idea of take the blue pill, if you want to very much simplify what's happening. So, I think there's a set of, alternatives that tend to be more focused on indifference, on the idea of do nothing, nihilism, right? That essentially is your blue pill approach that's like, we should not care really about sort of the larger political implications of things. We don't really have free will, and our assumption that we have free will oftentimes be auto-deconstructive. The other side of this is they'll have an alternative that seems like, radical mimicry or acceleration. And even this is sort of a blue pill approach. Like their point basically is just like we should let the system run in the way that it does, or maybe even accelerate the way that the system is running. And it shouldn't really affect us. We should just continue to be indifferent. And that's tends to be sort of the general strategy for the negative is they're going for a very strong presumption push with a K-stern and maybe a small external impact. So as such, the affirmative needs to have sort of a very strong criticism of this idea of indifference in the face of what we currently have. I imagine that a radical acceleration of right populist movements in the current climate protests, in the climate of protests about George Floyd seems like a very bad idea, right? Or, sort of talking about what it would mean to be indifferent or accelerate or mimic a situation in relationship to what your affirmative is talking about allows you to pose a set of impact turn arguments to the alternatives that have been proposed. And that's sort of the way that you want to think about it. Very last thing I want to include, permutation work. Permutation work against Baudrillard is actually one of the more interesting areas. And I have to say the things that I most struggled with as a negative debater reading a set of Baudrillard arguments was well-worded permutations. So let's take it from the top, right? The concept one is the idea like that there's no sort of subjectivity and there's no free will, that we should not be responsible for all of the circuits that intersect us and are seducing us. It's like, if that's true, it seems like permutation to the alternative that severs the 1AC is also equally irresponsible, equally not being held to being responsible for the link arguments that are being made by the Baudrillard critique. If there are arguments about why information is dissuasive and we should radically accelerate, it seems like a set of permutation arguments that, radically accelerate contradictory information might actually solve the set of link arguments that they're making, right? And sort of leveraging and thinking about, how you might describe a permutation in the face of a set of link arguments that might have more general application is something that is helpful. That being said, my suggestion is not to you should not just sort of take the same permutation and try to spin the same argument. You want to sort of look at what the link and impact arguments that are associated are. If they're only making a Baudrillard critique of deterrence, showing up and being like, permutation, we're not responsible for anything, is unlikely to win you a debate because they're just going to be like we just made an argument about deterrence, so you lose. Right? So, I would sort of like scrutinize a lot of the evidence, see sort of what larger themes their evidence is, talking about. So if they have a larger critique of responsibility, a larger critique of sort of language and its contradictory nature, that's something that you can work with, as opposed to just sort of a general critique of deterrence, in which case you should just defend your deterrence advantage. Yeah, okay. I think we can call it that. Does anybody have any questions? I know that I ranted for a little bit, and I know that there's probably elements of this where you're like, what were you talking about?
Yeah, I had a question. I didn't catch the AF card that you mentioned on like the examples. Yeah.
So I think the AF card that I mentioned was on the concept one, right? So that was on the subject versus object. There's a Todd May, it's like May and 5 card that sort of talks about even if sort of subjectivity is not static, that it's in flux, that we should still try to, assume a fiction of the subject because it allows us to solve things in the real world, immediate harm, et cetera, that requires us to have a fiction of responsibility. In terms of the set of cards to answer sort of concept 2, I think that tends to vary because the set of arguments people make tend to vary. So if it's this idea of politics being dissuasive, if I was reading a critical AF, I would look at Roland Bleicher. He has a 2005 article that talks about sort of the effectiveness of protests and essentially sort of how they're able to change sort of the conversation regardless of the larger, hyperreal spin that might exist. Another sort of set of authors that I think would be useful for your more policy arguments would be, I don't think there's an author, but, finding a set of arguments that in the Trump era, it is actually valuable to, go in depth and try to rationally persuade people. These cards definitely exist, right? Like the cards that are like, we need to be able to sift through fake news, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the cards that, are going to be very useful for the affirmative for that set of arguments. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. What about framework?
Good question. I think framework arguments on Baudrillard tend to be kind of an obfuscation more than anything else. So framework arguments tend to just be like, you don't get to weigh the aff, and maybe that your sort of assumption that, we should talk about cost benefits of debate don't really do anything. So like if information is dissuasive, what is the point of being like, we're going to have a cost benefit calculation of whether the affirmative is better than the status quo or competitive option, right? So, your framework argument probably looks something like, our larger theory is a prior question for this debate to matter at all. And then that's sort of the way that you would pose a set of arguments. But I do think that those framework arguments are largely inseparable from the thesis claim that you're making, if that makes sense. So, think about these framework arguments less as, one link, we win, because it's not like an ethics argument. Baudrillard is not about ethics at all, really. He's just like, there's zero effectiveness to the thing that you're planning to do. And so, like, what's the point of it all is sort of most of where that's going. Another thing that might be helpful if you're planning to read sort of a negative Baudrillard argument is, I'd say that so for the AF, the best set of arguments are about fairness, not about skills. The skills thing is the thing that they're ready to debate. The fairness thing is the thing that doesn't make any sense with their theory, right? It's like, they can't really suggest that fairness doesn't matter or does matter. If their whole point is all things are, it's just like, basically you can make a set of arguments that's like, our argument is not that we should be responsible for the set of political education that we get. Our argument is simply is that debate is the game, and we should irresponsibly play with a bunch of political ideas, and we think that's fun. It's like that, there's no Baudrillard answer really to that argument. For the negative, the set of impact turns to fairness that I would make would be in relationship to some of the radical alterity stuff that I talked about before. So it might be like, your fear of sort of like complete deviance, not just difference, but deviance that is not understandable, etc., is the thing that leads to the expulsion of the other, etc. That'll sort of help generate your set of impact turn arguments to fairness.
Wait, how does our framework interrelate to that? Because we're just saying, can we weigh the AF, please? So like, how is there a link to you're excluding the other and that's bad?
The way that I would frame it on the AF, so like this is not like I'm not really saying like this is the death knell for fairness arguments, but I do think that the set of negative arguments I would make in response would be to say, the affirmative only allows for a set of speech acts and debates that are different but not radically altered, right? So it would allow for example, the difference of the abolition K. Like we think it's acceptable to, debate over the confines of the plan, but as soon as we debate a set of folks who are just like, we don't prefer to be plan focused, that are radically unintelligible, then we tend to exclude those others. I think the AF can be like, no, that's not really the point of fairness. You can make a set of arguments about how it is a competition, and in fact, both sides are playing set competition. You might make a set of arguments. It's like, it seems a little weird that you're talking about the expulsion of others, considering that we shouldn't be responsible. These are sort of like claims that I think you can make to respond back to that negative argument. Any other questions? And I'm sorry we, had maybe 50 minutes of going galaxy brain for a little while.
I know this is like a really stupid question, but
Yeah.
I'm a little confused about how I guess the point of reading the Baudrillard K is that you shouldn't like persuade people to do anything because that never works. So then if you've persuaded the judge that that is true, doesn't that like kind of, I don't know, moot your claim?
Possibly so. So like you could make a set of arguments that's like, if information is truly dissuasive, you've informed the judge of your very dissuasive information. That being said, my sort of take tends to be, so if you're negative, my suggestion, there's two ways that people have sort of done this. One way is to just be like, we're just levying a presumption claim functionally. So it's just like, I guess our thing is dissuasive too, but it's like all things are dissuasive. So like, what is the point? Yes, the judge might vote for you, for example, that, they think that in this debate, Baudrillard is correct, but did you truly persuade them that your argument is true? It's like, the whole point of debate is that it's detached from your opinion and you've just sort of adjudicated a set of decisions. So the assumption that there is a greater persuasive effect is something that should be, excised. So that's one way that I would answer it, probably the more persuasive way than the second version, which is that, some Baudrillard teams will like make this like claim that like the double turn is the solvency, which is kind of stupid. But their claim essentially being that we should accelerate and mimic sort of the forms of persuasive activity to their endpoint, and that is kind of the point of the alternative. I think that version is dumb because it's like, well, like if you're sort of starting with double turns are the solvency, then the permutation could also include a bunch of contradictory things, which is the solvency, so you lose. So I would instead stick with the former, which is like the point of debate is not, it's not a persuasive activity. That's kind of the whole point, right? You're just voting for arguments that, you know, in this debate had more effect than any other. And your sort of ultimate claim is that sort of the larger persuasive element that you're saying that exists in a version of skills arguments, et cetera, is something that is completely moot and should zero the affirmative.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I do think that one of the hard things for a negative Baudrillard think team to do is to toe the line between not sounding like the permutation. So like the more you sound like the double turn of the solvency, the more you sound like you're losing, in my mind. And the more you sound like, you know, we've made some weird semantic distinction, the better off you'll be, because the affirmative is likely to just repeat the thing they said in the 2AC. That being said, AFs, you should make sure to sort of, you know, figure out sort of what language that they're using and directly respond to the kinds of language that are being used so that you can more easily make a set of permutation and all take out arguments. Any other questions about Baudrillard Neg AF?
You said that fatal strategies and the intelligence of evil is a good like starting place.
Yeah, so if I was reading Neg stuff, I'd start with the intelligence of evil. I would also read fatal strategies. And then the link cards, the best link cards are in Simulacra and Simulations. The reason why I didn't really start with that, usually people like to read that book, but that book is kind of just like 12 chapters on 12 different things. So it's like chapter 1 is on nukes, and like Baudrillard writes about nukes randomly. And then like chapter 2 is about animal testing. So it's like, it's not like he's writing a philosophy, it's just like a collection of links. So like that makes sense once you've understood what's going on. So I would sort of start with the intelligence of evil is I think the closest thing he comes to like a systematic rendering of his philosophy. Fatal strategies is like a close second, and then the rest of his books are like, you know, here's just a bunch of link arguments. Essentially, it's like Baudrillard is musing about X, and that's essentially how he is, you know, scripted most of his books. You might then understand also why it's been so good as a debate argument, because it's like, oh, like this book is book of links, and then this book is book of alts, and it's like very easy to sort of put together a set of critique arguments that apply basically across the board to all apps. So the reason why, you know, my debate career was relatively sustainable was because Baudrillard writes so much about so many different things that it's like there's always a link, and there's always a set of alternative arguments. Any other questions?
What do you think is the best neg response to this sort of like accelerating right-wing populism is bad? Or how do you think they would make a distinction?
I would be like, so for the negative, I would say something like that's the status quo. So having a bunch of Hillary Clintons doesn't stop that, right? I would say something like, you know, the sort of intrusion of a bunch of sort of persuasive elements of leftist politics just results in sort of that vertigo of interpretation that Baudrillard is talking about, where it's just like both sides just say stuff and then nothing happens. In which case, you know, the point should be nihilism. Like we should not attempt to red pill our way through, you know, the climate of protest. We should just be like the debate has zero connection to being able to solve anything in those protests, and we should pretend to be, you know, we should stop pretending and stop being so arrogant as to assume that there is a relationship. That's usually also the way to sort of, for the negative, you know, a lot of affirmative teams will ask the question like, you know, what does your alternative propose about, you know, this horrible thing that's happening? So they'll be like, what does your alternative do about police brutality? Or what does your affirmative do about like violence that's being, you know, done to minority populations? And the negative response should just be like, what does the AF do? Right? It's like, what does debate do to do and like solve any of those things? And that's sort of the diversion tactic that you want to take for a Baudrillard team, to just be like, no, like the whole premise of our argument is that what your pretense that you are doing something is the thing that we have criticized as auto-deconstructive. right? And that's sort of the frame that you want to take, and divert a lot of these "what will you do" questions to be like, "what do you do?" Which sort of helps you quite a bit.
I've heard like a lot of AF teams will like ask the neg about something really horrible that happened in the past, like the World War II question. How should the neg answer that?
Maybe describe what you mean by the world, because I don't quite know what you mean.
Because like sometimes they'll be like, in the world of the alt, like if there was like during World War II, are you saying that we shouldn't have done anything? Like, should we have been nihilist? That kind of question.
Good question. So I would actually turn that premise back on you, right? So if I was negative, I would say something like, the assumption that you would do anything about World War II, that debate would do anything about World War II, is something that we've criticized to begin with. So it's like, I think the way to sort of think about this is, the Baudrillard argument is not the world doesn't exist out there. It's that when language is mediating the world, that it loses its objective reference. So it's like, talking about it in debates and trying to persuade people about it is the wrong move, right? So like, that's where you have to fall back on it as the negative and always sort of return back to. And the AF always has to avoid that diversion and be like, yeah, okay, like sure, like in debates, something, but it's like, what would you do instead, right? It's like, yeah, there's a climate of protests that are happening. What is your model of debate? Is your model of debate just like everybody reading Baudrillard together? Like, that doesn't sound very good either, right? And like, having a set of arguments then that are like, these are sort of some areas in which persuasion has been effective, is a good sort of affirmative strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I think we can call it. Thanks for coming. I will have this up, and we'll at some point post it in your links, I imagine. If you have any other pressing Baudrillard questions, you can feel free to just contact me. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Cool. Thanks, Shree.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shree.
Thank you.
Put your email in the chat.
Yeah. It's just Shree.debate@gmail. So my name, debate@gmail.com. You also have my Slack from